Hi, this is Paul McGuire, and there's a lot of stuff that I want to talk about, and you've been following the news, and it's heavy stuff, but it really has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed from a spiritual perspective. You know, there's a lot of people in the media who give analysis, and it's a geopolitical or socioeconomic analysis. And I understand that because in my own career, I've been a guest commentator on the Fox News Network and CNN and other major news outlets on the biggest cable news network shows there are. And I've debated the leading economists and politicians and prime ministers and so on and so forth. But you know, one thing that always bothered me about these debates or discussions I would have would be, one, the lack of questions regarding how spirituality, how God interfaces with the real world. And you may say, well, that it's not appropriate on a news program. Well, nonsense, absolute total nonsense. That's an arbitrary fragmentation of reality, a consensual agreement between talking heads and their masters, if you will, the 6 corporations that control the media, not to discuss spirituality as if it didn't exist. You see, because if you don't ask questions about spirituality and how spirituality applies into the geopolitical realm, then you're inferring quite loudly in the subtext that it is either irrational, delusional, and that it doesn't matter. And no serious person should give it any consideration because, after all, a, quote, logical, sane, rational individual keeps those things up on the back shelf. Well, nonsense again. That's fragmenting reality, and quite frankly, I wearied of that. I wearied of that because I began the systematic study of not only science and scientific research from the time I was a kid. You know, in first and second and third grade, I was reading the biography of every great scientist. And I'm talking about heavy-duty stuff for a second and third grader, you know. The biographies of Louis Pasteur, Albert Einstein, Robert Oppenheimer, science fiction authors that dealt with hard science like Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and Enrico Fermi, and I mean, I could go on for 30 minutes naming scientists, Francis Crick, and so on and so forth. So science has something to bring to the table, obviously. But when we're looking at what the world is facing now, which is the potential or the high probability of a World War III scenario, and then we look at the predictive prophecies in the Bible, for example, Bible prophecy, and we see that there are hundreds of prophecies in the Bible that name nations, that talk about events that are happening right here, right now, before our eyes. They're being fulfilled. So any way you want to slice it, if you're going to look at, for example, Syria, Russia, the United States, Great Britain, the European Union, and Israel and Iran, you have to integrate the fact that the Bible, going back 4,000 years or more, and sometimes, depending upon which prophecies, going back 2,000 years, talks in extensive detail about scenarios like the very one that we find ourselves in the Middle East, regarding Syria, regarding Russia, regarding Iran, regarding the United States, regarding the European Union. And because of that, I found it increasingly frustrated to go on the big shows, if you will, on the cable channels, and not be able to integrate this information into the context of the subject. Now, let me give you a case in point. My new book, by the way, which is called A Prophecy of the Future of America, you can probably see part of the poster for the book cover, that will be out soon. And for those of you that pre-ordered it, you will be getting your copy relatively soon, before the general public. And the reason it has taken me so long to write it is because every time I would get to the place of finishing it, there would be a download or a deluge, if you will, of an enormous amount of information that was absolutely relevant to the topic, A Prophecy of the Future of America. Now, we stand at what could be the early or initial phases of World War III. Now, what makes this interesting, though, and interesting is kind of not a good word, because it's not interesting, it's tragic. What makes it alarming, if you will, is the fact that the ancient biblical prophets, let's just name Ezekiel, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 38, he predicts a end times invasion by a nation, Russia, Iran, and Syria. And Russia, Iran, and Syria are named by name, along with a consortium of Middle Eastern nations, which appear to be Turkey. Turkey exists today. And by the way, Turkey is a key player in this conflict. The European Union, and other nations. They're named in Ezekiel 38. Now, the United States, per se, is not named in Ezekiel 38. But as I disclose in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America, I show that the United States of America is very much front and center in the geopolitical events and the prophetic events that are exploding right now before our very eyes. It's just America named under a different name. So we see this predicted invasion of Russia and Iran and Syria with other nations to attack Israel in the last days. Now, why that's interesting is because all of those nations dominate the media every single moment of the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle. This conflict that the United States is involved in with Syria, this really isn't about the United States of America versus Syria so much as it is the United States of America versus Russia. See, who we're really fighting is Russia. And Russia is the bear, or Russia is Rosh. And Russia is, according to Ezekiel, headed by a very powerful angelic being, a territorial spirit, if you will. Now, if you were to bring this up on a cable news show, you would be, well, this is how it would go down, because I brought up very light subjects, and this is how it went down. They would politely cut to a commercial, and that would be at the end of your interview, because they don't acknowledge the fact that there are dimensions beyond this physical sensory world that we live in, and therefore, if you bring up something which is impinges upon this reality, but it's from another dimension. It's scoffed at, despite the fact that quantum physics and string theory say that there are 11 dimensions. Despite the fact that the leading modern physicists and mathematicians say there are 11 dimensions, the news media, for all practical purposes, says there's only the physical dimensions, or a three-dimensional world. So, according to the biblical worldview, there is an invisible realm, or a spiritual reality, or a parallel universe that moves simultaneously or concurrently with the universe that we live in. So, in these predictions by these prophets who had a supernatural revelation 4,000 years before our time period, they were able to see supernaturally into the future and see this invasion of Israel in the last days. Now, they named the names of the nations, thousands of years, and yet these nations dominate the news. And when you read Ezekiel 38, the key player, the number one nation is Russia. And the number one nation that the U.S. is engaged in this conflict is Russia. Why is that? Well, there are geopolitical economic reasons for that, which I go into great detail in my book, A Prophecy of the Future of America. I get into the specifics, both spiritually and in terms of Bible prophecy, but also economics and geopolitics and military theaters and things like that. You can go to my website, www.paulmcguire.com, and McGuire is M-C-G-U-I-R-E, or www.paulmcguire.org. Again, McGuire is M-C-G-U-I-R-E. And at paulmcguire.org, you can get the blog. On either website, you can sign up for the free prophetic intelligence report, which gets e-blasted to you. And then we're on an entire spectrum of social media globally. So Russia is a key player in this. And the reason